He was born a bastard in the eyes of the world, though he never truly felt he belonged to either side of the narrow line that separated Winterfell's great hall from the hidden recesses where a baseborn child might live out his days. Jon Snow did not seek crowns or accolades, nor did he cling to the idea that his lineage might someday elevate him. All he ever wanted was to prove that he could be of use, to his father, to his siblings, to the realm itself. In another life, he joined the Night's Watch and cloaked himself in black, forswearing any claim to lands and titles. In that existence, his parentage, always uncertain, would not matter, and in the far north, he found a sense of family among the Brothers of the Watch. But fate can bend the known path beyond recognition. And in this telling, another arrangement took shape, one that saw him slip free of the vows he never took, stand beneath the heart trees of the north, and wed a princess who carried in her veins the blood of House Baratheon. It happened in the months following King Robert Baratheon's death, when the War of the Five Kings threatened to tear Westeros asunder. House Lannister held King's Landing, crowning Joffrey as the successor to Robert. House Stark had marched south in outrage over the imprisonment of Lord Eddard Stark, who had uncovered the secret of Cersei Lannister's children, and the conflict widened into something unstoppable. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, moved from Dragonstone to press his own claim, proclaiming Joffrey a bastard born of incest. Lords great and small weighed their allegiances, each seeking advantage or trying simply to survive. The north felt unsteady underfoot, as if the ground might crack and swallow entire houses without warning. Jon had been preparing to leave Winterfell for the Wall, determined to join the Night's Watch, when news came that his father had been arrested in King's Landing, accused of treason. Dire tidings followed. Robert Baratheon was dead under suspicious circumstances, and Eddard Stark's life hung by a thread at the mercy of the Lannisters. Robb Stark, newly named Lord of Winterfell, summoned the northern banners and marched south. That left Winterfell dangerously exposed, with only a skeleton force remaining. The swirling chaos seemed determined to pull Jon along for the ride. He watched Robb depart, feeling an odd mixture of pride and helplessness, torn between his longing to help and the sense that, as a bastard, he had no place on that battlefield. Yet events would unfold in a manner that forced his path far from the cold stones of Castle Black. One crucial turn arrived on a day thick with tense expectation, when a raven bearing King Stannis' seal arrived at Winterfell. The letter urged the North to reconsider whom they might call their king. In it, Stannis insisted he was the rightful heir to Robert, and that Joffrey's rule was a sham. He painted himself as the champion of justice, a lonely sentinel against corruption. The letter was addressed not only to Robb Stark as Lord of Winterfell, but also to any who might see reason. Because Robb had already marched, the letter was received by Maester Luwin and shared with the remaining Starks, Bran, Rickon, and Jon as the eldest male left behind. The tone was direct, demanding a northern alliance. In exchange for their fealty, Stannis offered recognition of the North's autonomy and certain provisions once the war ended in his victory. And hidden near the bottom of the parchment was a mention of a marriage that could seal the pact. Stannis proposed that his only daughter, Shireen Baratheon, be wed to a Stark, binding the North to House Baratheon. The obvious choice would have been Robb, had he still been in Winterfell. But he was off leading armies, and besides, he might have had his own marriage pacts to secure the loyalty of House Frey or other southern houses. Bran was too young, Rickon younger still, and the daughters were either in King's Landing or with Robb. That left the question of Jon. The letter from Stannis specifically suggested the possibility that Lord Eddard Stark's bastard could be legitimized if he accepted the alliance, thereby bringing the Baratheon princess into the Stark fold. It was an offer that might have made many a bastard's head spin with dreams of inheritance and glory. But it left Jon uneasy. It felt like a realm-shaking choice, one that might pit him against everything he believed he should be. Yet his father's fate was uncertain, and the North needed every ally it could muster. Maester Luwin carefully set the letter on the table, his face drawn and pensive, and Jon realized that Winterfell needed a decision. Jon agonized over it. He was not blind to the potential. If Stannis was victorious, House Stark would be strengthened, the king in the North recognized, and the path to vengeance against the Lannisters opened wide. Jon knew how precarious their situation was. Eddard Stark was in captivity, and who could say if Sansa or Arya fared any better at the capital? Word was that Joffrey had named himself king, and Cersei Lannister was pulling the strings. The North's forces were valiantly trying to rescue Lord Stark, but the war had no certainty. Then there was Stannis, who had Melisandre of Ashai whispering in his ear, brandishing the dire proclamations of the Lord of Light. Many Northerners balked at the idea of such foreign gods. Yet if Stannis was the rightful heir and could be an ally if he could help free Ned Stark, then perhaps his cause deserved a closer look. With the letter came a small retinue of Stannis's men, solemn knights who waited in the great hall of Winterfell. Jon recalled meeting them, scanning their faces for duplicity. He found only a somber conviction reflected in their eyes. They spoke of Stannis as a stern but just man, one who neither laughed easily nor broke easily. One of them, Ser Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, had a quiet sincerity that earned Jon's respect. Davos told Jon about Shireen, how she was kind-hearted, timid in some ways, yet strong in spirit. She bore the grayscale scars upon her face, though she was long since cured of the disease. She was lonely on Dragonstone, overshadowed by the flames of Melisandre's red god. But Stannis loved her in his own stoic fashion. That fatherly love had prompted this alliance, and Stannis believed that her marriage into the Stark lineage would not only strengthen his political position, but might also bring Shireen a measure of acceptance she had never known. Thus Jon found himself at a crossroads. Part of him yearned to keep his vow, his intention, at least, to join the Night's Watch. But he had not yet spoken his vows, and even the Night's Watch would do little for the realm if the entire land collapsed into chaos. Winterfell needed a figure it could rely upon, someone to hold it together in Robb's absence. If Jon bent the knee to Stannis and took Shireen to wife, a bastardy that had always set him apart might be transformed into the foundation of a new alliance. He dreaded how Robb might react. His half-brother had declared himself king in the north, an act that complicated any fealty to Stannis. But perhaps there was a path forward. If Stannis recognized Robb's kingship, or, at the very least, recognized northern independence, they could be allies rather than rivals. In the end, with each passing day bringing worse tidings from King's Landing, Jon accepted. He would wed Shireen Baratheon in a ceremony that bridged the traditions of both houses. Letters went back and forth, carried by tired ravens that fluttered into Winterfell's rookery and collapsed from exhaustion. Stannis, from Dragonstone, gave his official blessing. Melisandre, with her red robes and unsettling presence, insisted that Lawloress flames had shown her this was the path to victory. The lords of the north who remained behind were uncertain, but some recognized the advantage. House Manderly, House Serwyn, House Glover, those who still lingered near Winterfell, cautiously voiced their approval. An alliance with a Baratheon might see the Lannisters undone, and that was a prize worth some discomfort. When Shireen Baratheon arrived at Winterfell, it was at the head of a small procession led by Melisandre and Ser Davos. The journey had been long and dangerous, skirting the warring territories. The watchers on the battlements saw the Baratheon banners approaching, the crowned stag on a field of gold, flanked by the red blazing heart of the Lord of Light. Shireen rode a dark mare, her hood drawn up to protect her from the bitter northern wind. She was 14, the same age as Arya Stark would have been had she still been safely at Winterfell. Her face bore the gray, scaly patches on one cheek and part of her neck, reminders of the sickness that nearly claimed her as a child. Yet she held her head high. Nervousness tightened her brow, but there was also a quiet hope in her eyes. Jon came out to greet her in the courtyard. He wore plain attire for the moment. His cloak was gray, the direwolf sigil on his breast. He was unaccustomed to playing the lord, and even less comfortable with the notion of being a groom. As Shireen dismounted, accompanied by Ser Davos's helpful hand, Jon stepped forward and offered a short bow of respect. She curtsied in return, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Neither knew quite what to say. They'd exchanged only a few letters. Shireen had practiced lines of courtesy, but upon seeing him, young, solemn, hair dark as a crow's wings, her mind went blank. Her father had told her that this marriage was her duty, to unite houses, to claim the North's loyalty. She had accepted with a trembling resolve. Now, standing in Winterfell's courtyard, she could not help but feel a small flutter of relief. Jon Snow seemed kind in his reserved way. Perhaps it would not be so terrible. Their wedding was held in the Godswood beneath the ancient heart tree, as was the custom of the North. The old gods bore silent witness in the carved face of the weirwood, its red sap tears trickling down white bark. Maester Luwin presided alongside Melisandre, a curious combination that spoke to this union's unusual nature. The men of the North, those who had not marched with Robb, gathered in cautious observance, while Shireen's small retinue stood near her, keeping the banners of the stag and the fiery heart. There was no great feast afterward, for war loomed too near, and the resources of Winterfell were stretched thin. Yet they managed a modest celebration in the great hall, with cups of ale, bread fresh from the ovens, and roasted meats. The Starks who remained, Bran, Rickon, Hodder, and even old Nan, looked on with varying degrees of curiosity and hope. Shireen smiled timidly whenever any of them approached. She did not know how to begin forging friendships, but she tried. Ser Davos guided her gently, introducing her to northern customs, while Jon looked on, wondering how to make this new Baratheon princess feel welcome in a land of wolves and snow. So began their marriage, more an alliance by necessity than a union by love, but gradually shaped by mutual respect. Jon found Shireen to be gentle and observant. She was used to the cold, aloof nature of her father, and though Jon was quiet, he had a warmth beneath his reserve that comforted her. They spoke of books, of the stories she loved from her lonely days on Dragonstone. They walked through Winterfell's courtyards, and she giggled at the sight of the direwolves, especially Ghost, who shadowed Jon like a silent guardian. She was skittish around the albino wolf at first, but slowly learned to trust him when she saw how calm he was around Jon. Meanwhile, the people of Winterfell tried to adjust to having a Baratheon princess in their midst. Shireen's scars drew some looks, but the Northerners had long been taught not to judge by appearances. Over time, they saw her small kindnesses, her determination to learn the ways of the North, and they began to embrace her as one of their own. Jon, for his part, worried often about his father, about Robb, about the war. Messengers came and went, bringing tidings of battle. Joffrey reigned in King's Landing with cruelty, Tywin Lannister was on the move, and the Riverlands were awash in blood. Robb Stark was winning victories but losing men with each confrontation. Rumors also spread that Renly Baratheon, Stannis' younger brother, had declared himself king as well, gathering the might of the Reach and the Stormlands. The Baratheon cause thus splintered, and Stannis was said to be in a fury, determined to remove any pretender. Jon found himself pulled into councils he never imagined. He was no strategist. All he had was a sense of honor inherited from Ned Stark and a willingness to learn. But now he was the representative of the North's alliance with House Baratheon, a role forced upon him by the ring on his finger and the bride who looked to him each night for reassurance that everything would be all right. Not long after the wedding, a second letter arrived from Stannis. In it, he commended Jon for honoring the pact and recognized him formally as Jon Stark, a legitimate son of Eddard Stark, an edict Stannis could issue only by virtue of calling himself the King of Westeros. To many Northerners, the letter held no legal weight, as Robb Stark had declared himself king in the North, separate from the Iron Throne. Nonetheless, the legitimization changed how many viewed Jon. He was no longer simply the bastard at Winterfell. Now he was a Stark in name with all the responsibilities that entailed. This rankled some lords who worried it would sow confusion between Jon's claim and Robb's. But as the war raged on, necessity often outweighed tradition. Jon had mixed feelings. He had grown to accept the name Snow. It was who he was, no matter how the world might treat him for it. The new name, Jon Stark, felt awkward on his tongue. But if it helped his father, if it helped Robb, if it helped the realm by forging alliances, then he would bear it. That same letter instructed Jon to prepare for the arrival of Stannis himself. The king in his own right intended to push northward, possibly to use White Harbor as a staging ground to strike at the Lannisters from a new angle. Rumors abounded that Stannis also intended to bring Melisandre's fire magic to the heart of the North, though no one quite knew what shape that would take. Shireen, upon reading her father's words, brightened at the thought of seeing him again, though she feared for his safety in the war. She confided her worries to Jon, who listened in solemn silence and tried his best to reassure her. If Stannis could reach Winterfell safely, perhaps father and daughter could be reunited, and the new alliance strengthened for whatever lay ahead. The path, however, would not be easy. The crossing of armies from Dragonstone to the north was fraught with peril. Renly, far to the south, had a larger force. The Lannisters had their gold and their cunning. Stannis stood alone, reliant on the Red Woman's prophecies. With each passing day, the atmosphere in Winterfell grew more tense. The nights grew darker, as if the old gods themselves brooded over the land. Far beyond the political struggles, an even greater threat stirred in the far north. Reports trickled down from the few rangers who returned from the Wall that the White Walkers were no longer just a tale for the small folk. But in the chaos of the war, few paid heed to such warnings. Jon had nightmares sometimes, images of icy figures moving through swirling snow. He tried to push them from his mind. One war at a time, he told himself. Yet in the quiet hours, he remembered old Nan's stories of the long night and the terrors that lurked beyond the wall. He found himself confiding in Shireen, who listened with wide, frightened eyes but did not dismiss his fears. Winter months in the north stretched before them. The vow to remain strong echoed in each of Jon's actions. He strove to show leadership, for the sake of the castle's people and in honor of his father's example. He had grown up watching Ned Stark pass fair judgments and treat even the smallest folk with dignity. In that respect, Jon found the role of caretaker came somewhat naturally. He met with the stewards, oversaw the distribution of food and supplies, ensuring that Winterfell would not starve through the extended turmoil. Shireen, shy though she was, accompanied him at times, learning to greet those who served the castle, offering a gentle smile or a kind word. The lords who visited saw the young couple working in tandem and, if not impressed, at least began to recognize that the alliance was functional. Eventually, word reached Winterfell that Robb Stark had won a major victory at Oxcross, but the fighting dragged on. Tywin Lannister regrouped, the Tyrells remained tied to Renly or biding their time, and none of it seemed to be heading toward a quick resolution. Meanwhile, Stannis hammered at his brother's supporters in the Stormlands. The realm was fractured beyond immediate repair. In these uneasy weeks, Shireen blossomed in small ways. Away from the gloom of Dragonstone and the overshadowing presence of Melisandre, she discovered pockets of joy. The direwolves fascinated her. Grey Wind had gone south with Robb, but Ghost was often by Jon's side, and Summer and Shaggy Dog stayed near Bran and Rickon. Occasionally, Shireen would see them frolicking in the courtyard, and she watched with childlike wonder. She found she liked the crypts, too, for their ancient statues, though they gave her chills. She would wander there with a candle while Jon oversaw matters of state, running her fingers lightly over the carved faces of old Stark kings and lords. The weight of history pressed down on her, making her feel small yet connected to something vast. Letters from Stannis began arriving more frequently, relayed by ravens and coded couriers. The tone remained urgent. Stannis demanded more support from the north, more soldiers to shore up his efforts against both Renly and the Lannisters. Jon was in a difficult position. He had nominal authority in Winterfell during Robb's absence, but the majority of northern forces were already committed to Robb's campaign. Even if he had the power to muster more men, would that not mean pulling them from the defense of the north itself? And so a web of conflicting loyalties took shape. Jon found himself writing carefully worded replies, explaining that the North had already expended great efforts and blood in their battles in the Riverlands. He stressed that as soon as Robb returned or sent word, they could better coordinate. But Stannis's messages grew more insistent, hinting that if the North failed to support the rightful king, the alliance could be in jeopardy. Jon shared these concerns with Shireen, who relayed what she knew of her father's temperament. "He is a hard man," she said softly, her eyes flicking to the flickering torchlight in the corridor. He never forgets a slight, though he tries to be fair. He will not forgive easily if he believes the North breaks faith. Jon nodded grimly, wondering if this was the noose around his neck. If he could not rally men to Stannis, would that endanger Ned Stark's chance of rescue, or the whole realm's chance to see the Lannisters brought low? And what of his half-brother, newly crowned king in the North? Would Robb view Jon's loyalty to Stannis as a betrayal? Compounding the tension, a messenger arrived from the Night's Watch, bringing a plea for aid. The Watch had too few men, and reports of wildlings gathering under a king named Mance Rayder spelled trouble. Darker rumors spoke of whites and White Walkers. Jon read the letter in stunned silence, recalling the stories. His gut. Why warred with itself? The vow he had once intended to make to the Night's Watch, the vow he never ended up speaking, still seemed to tug at his conscience. But he was no longer free to choose that path. He was a husband, a legitimized Stark, a piece on the board in the Game of Thrones. Yet the warning from the Watch chilled him more than any threat from Stannis. If the realms of men squabbled amongst themselves while an ancient evil awoke in the far north, who would stand against it? He brought the matter to Shireen, who listened with wide, thoughtful eyes. Together, they sent a message of their own to Stannis, urging him to consider the threat of the North beyond the Wall. They appealed to his sense of duty as the rightful king. Stannis's reply was guarded but not dismissive. He wrote that first he must solidify his hold on the throne, for if he could not wrest power from the Lannisters and quell his brother's rebellion, he would never have the resources to deal with any threat beyond the Wall. One war at a time, he declared. Meanwhile, winter edged closer, the days grew shorter, and the war in the south showed no signs of concluding. Amid all the uncertainty, Shireen discovered a quiet love for the library in Winterfell. With Jon's tacit permission, she pored over dusty tomes detailing the history of the North, the ancient deeds of the kings of winter, and even older records that hinted at the mysteries in the lands beyond. Sometimes, Bran accompanied her, equally fascinated by the old stories. They'd sit by the fireplace, Shireen turning pages while Bran listened intently, his direwolf summer curled protectively at his feet. Jon found them there one evening, pages scattered about, speaking in hushed voices of the children of the forest and the first men. They fell silent when he entered, but he simply smiled and asked them to continue. In such small moments he felt a fragile peace. But peace was always short-lived in a time of war. Another raven brought grim news. Ned Stark had been executed on the steps of the Great September of Baelor, beheaded by King Joffrey's command. The raven carried only the simplest statement from the capital, proclaiming Ned Stark a traitor who had conspired against the crown. The news struck Winterfell like a physical blow. Maester Luwin read the message aloud in the great hall, his voice quavering with grief. Jon stood there, numb, as tears welled in his eyes. Shireen placed a trembling hand on his arm, but words failed them both. The men in the hall recoiled in horror and anger. Rickon wailed inconsolably, and Bran retreated into a stunned silence. Eddard Stark was dead, and with him, a guiding light extinguished. In the days that followed, Winterfell cloaked itself in mourning. Every corridor felt more hollow, every face more etched with sorrow. Jon had lost the father he had known, the man who raised him with quiet dignity. Though Ned Stark had not been an overly affectionate man, Jon understood that he had cared deeply for all his children, baseborn or otherwise. And now, that calm presence was gone, replaced by the stark reality of war. Everyone looked to Jon for leadership. Bran was still only a boy, Rickon barely more than a toddler. Robb, far to the south, would undoubtedly vow vengeance, but he was not here to hold the North together. Sansa was said to be trapped in King's Landing, at the mercy of the Lannisters. Arya's whereabouts were uncertain. The duty fell to Jon, newly named Jon Stark, to keep the home fires burning. Grief transformed into anger. Lords who had wavered in their loyalties resolved themselves now to see the Lannisters toppled. Some called for immediate mobilization of every man able to lift a spear or sword. But winter was coming, and the North had practical needs. Jon wrestled with these decisions, guided by Maester Luwin's counsel. Shireen, likewise shaken by the news, Her father had despised Ned Stark for supporting Robert, but the cruelty of Joffrey's actions appalled her. Offered what comfort she could. They spent many an evening in the Godswood, her hand in his, as Jon quietly remembered the man who had raised him. The dire wolves would circle them, as if sensing their loss. Word of Ned Stark's execution spread like wildfire through the realm, igniting further conflict. Renly Baratheon declared that such tyranny must be answered, rallying lords to his side. Stannis found more impetus to proclaim the Lannisters usurpers. The war only intensified. Among these swirling tides came the final impetus for Stannis to march north. He feared that the might of House Tyrell would bolster Renly to an unbeatable degree, so perhaps forging a separate path, allying more closely with the north, would be his best option. He sent word that he would soon land in White Harbor. When Stannis arrived, it was not in secret or subtlety. His ships were sighted off the coast, and the banners of the crowned stag flew high. Winterfell received news of his landing, and Jon, as the newly legitimized Stark, prepared to ride to White Harbor to greet him. He brought a small honor guard, accompanied by Shireen, who insisted on reuniting with her father. The journey took them through winding roads with the first flakes of winter snow swirling about. The cold was biting, but the retinue endured. At White Harbor, Lord Wyman Manderly welcomed them with as much hospitality as these lean times allowed. Stannis' presence was as formidable as expected. He arrived with dark hair peppered with gray, a heavy brow, a jaw set like iron. At his side was Melisandre, robed in red, her eyes filled with the heat of her faith. Shireen rushed forward to greet her father, who placed a stiff hand upon her shoulder. She then introduced Jon, who inclined his head respectfully. For a moment, Stannis regarded Jon with a calculating gaze, as if measuring his worth. He acknowledged Jon's newly granted name, Stark, but made no gesture of warmth. He was a man of duty, not affection. Still, Shireen smiled in relief that the meeting had not turned sour. They convened in Lord Manderly's hall to discuss the future. Stannis laid out a plan to push inland and gather any northern houses that might swear fealty to him. In exchange, he promised to support Robb Stark in retaking the Riverlands, or at least coordinate their strikes against the Lannisters. The details were complex, for Robb had named himself king in the north, while Stannis claimed the Iron Throne. Could two kings truly stand side by side? There were arguments well into the night. Voices raised, tempers flared. Stannis refused to bend on points he found critical, such as recognition of him as Robert's rightful heir. The northern lords bristled at the notion of giving up their hard-won independence. Jon tried to mediate, though he was young and uncertain of his place among these seasoned men. His marriage to Shireen was the reason they even sat at the same table. He reminded them of that, speaking softly of unity and the memory of Ned Stark, who had valued honor above all else. Stannis listened, though with a guarded skepticism. He asked Jon pointed questions. Did he truly believe the North would thrive under a separate crown forever, cut off from the rest of Westeros? What about the threat of the Lannisters, who would not rest until all rebels were crushed? And what of the threat beyond the wall, the one the Night's Watch had sent ravens about? Jon answered as best he could. The North wanted its freedom, but it also wanted vengeance for Ned Stark. If Stannis recognized Robb's claim as king in the North, at least for the duration of the war, perhaps once the Lannisters were defeated, an arrangement could be hashed out that satisfied both parties. Some manner of autonomy while still paying nominal homage to the Iron Throne under Stannis. As to the White Walkers, Jon pleaded for more men to be sent to the wall. Melisandre interjected, claiming her flames had shown her a great battle yet to come in the snow, where the forces of darkness would be met by a champion of R'hllor. She spoke with a fervor that unnerved many present. Stannis declared that once the usurpers, by which he meant the Lannisters and Renly, were dealt with, he would march to the wall himself if he had to save the realm. The Northmen exchanged uncertain glances, for it was no small claim. In the end, they hammered out a tentative pact. The North would lend some measure of support to Stannis' campaigns, and Stannis would uphold his recognition of the North's special status, deferring final settlement until after the Lannisters were defeated. The agreement was uneasy and full of potential pitfalls, but it was something. Shireen stood beside her father and husband, relieved that they had found a fragile middle ground. She sensed the tension in Stannis' posture, the unrelenting weight of the crown he claimed. She also felt Jon's uncertainty, how he tried to navigate these political waters without drowning. She wished there were a way to bring them closer, but father and husband were so very different. Stannis, iron-willed and stern, guided by Melisandre's flames and a rigid sense of justice. Jon, quiet and compassionate, driven by loyalty to his family and the North. The only link between them was Shireen herself, a girl who had grown up in the shadows of Dragonstone's dark halls. Once the pact was sealed by solemn oaths and handshakes, a new question arose. Would Stannis press south immediately, or spend the winter in the north? White Harbor, with its port, was more vulnerable than Winterfell, and the heavy snows were fast approaching. Marching an army through the biting cold seemed suicidal, so perhaps they would bide their time, gather strength, then strike in the spring. But waiting risked giving Renly and the Lannisters more time to consolidate power. Stannis seemed torn, conferring with his commanders daily. Melisandre urged him onward, claiming the flames showed a path to victory if they acted swiftly. Ser Davos Seaworth advised caution, citing the numerous logistical nightmares involved in a winter campaign. Jon watched, trying to learn from their counsel, even though he had no direct authority over Stannis' men. Meanwhile, the people of White Harbor saw the arrival of Baratheon soldiers and followers of the Red Faith. Tensions ran high in a city long devoted to the old gods and, to some extent, the Seven. Whispers circulated of shadowy powers, rumors that Melisandre could birth shadow assassins or conjure illusions. Shireen heard these whispers and quailed. She knew, in part, the strange power that Melisandre wielded, though she had been shielded from the worst of it on Dragonstone. She wondered if her father meant to use that power here in the north. The thought frightened her. She confided to Jon that perhaps they should caution Stannis against relying too heavily on Melisandre's magic, but Jon hesitated, uncertain if he had that right. He had learned enough to suspect that any confrontation with Melisandre might end poorly. Then a raven arrived bearing news from the west. Robb Stark had scored another victory, capturing Jaime Lannister in battle. The young wolf's legend grew. Some lords began to question whether they truly needed Stannis. If Robb kept winning, perhaps the North could simply declare itself free of the Iron Throne entirely. Jon knew, however, that the war was far from over. Tywin Lannister still commanded vast resources, and the Lannisters would not rest until they reclaimed their son. If Robb negotiated poorly, everything could collapse. The realm teetered on a knife's edge. Stannis chose to move on a smaller target first, the seat of House Bolton, the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton was rumored to be playing both sides, an unpredictable factor. If the Baratheon king could bring Bolton to heel, that would secure a large swath of the north and perhaps open the road to joining with Robb's forces in a two-front assault on the Lannisters. Yet, that plan meant traveling deeper into the heart of the north, a land Stannis did not know, in the grip of oncoming winter. White Harbor was rich but not infinite in supplies. Lord Manderly pledged some men, expecting that in the end, the Baratheon-led force would join Robb or at least not hamper him. Jon and Shireen faced a decision: remain in White Harbor or accompany Stannis' host as it marched deeper into the north. Stannis made it clear he wanted his daughter and her husband to come along, to serve as living proof of the Baratheon-Stark alliance. Jon worried that the journey might be too perilous for Shireen, but she insisted that her place was with her father, especially now that she was bound to Jon by marriage. The young couple prepared to travel once more, leaving the relative safety of White Harbor for an uncertain campaign under the Black Stag banner. The march was arduous from the start. Snow fell in relentless sheets, covering roads and fields, slowing their progress to a crawl. The Baratheon soldiers were not accustomed to such conditions. Even the northern men who marched with them were wary, for the storms could turn deadly at any moment. Provisions had to be carefully rationed. They led a line of supply carts, often bogged down in the drift. Stannis, never one to complain, rode at the head of the column, jaw set, eyes scanning the bleak landscape as if daring it to break him. Melisandre rode near him, her red robes a stark contrast to the white snow, unbothered by the cold. Jon and Shireen followed, flanked by a small guard of northern men who had pledged to protect the new Lady Stark Baratheon. They passed through villages where the sight of the stag banner next to the direwolf banner caused confusion. Some folk had heard of Robb Stark's victories, seeing him as their true king. Others whispered that Stannis was the rightful ruler by law. Few truly understood the complexities, and fewer still had any reason to care beyond their immediate survival. The presence of the Red Woman unnerved them most, leading to hushed speculation that she was some sort of witch come to claim their souls. Shireen did her best to calm fears, speaking gently to any who approached, but she was shy, and the scars on her face did little to dispel superstition. Jon occasionally tried to reassure the small folk, telling them that help was on the way, that the North and House Baratheon stood together against the Lannisters. Some believed him. Others simply thanked him politely and huddled by their fires. At night, as they camped in the howling wind, the cold became their greatest enemy. Tents offered little protection. Men huddled around fires, passing skins of ale or wine, trying to keep spirits from sinking into despair. The nights were long, the darkness profound. Sometimes Melisandre would walk among them, a solitary flame flickering in her hand, as she murmured prayers to Lawler. The men watched her with equal parts awe and fear. When she passed Jon and Shireen's tent, Shireen shivered, though whether from cold or something else, Jon could not tell. During these nights, father and daughter spoke little. Shireen would approach Stannis at times, hoping to share a moment of warmth, but Stannis's mind was consumed by the war. He offered her only curt reassurances. Still, that was more than some fathers gave, and Shireen cherished even the briefest recognition of her presence. Jon found his respect for her growing, seeing how she carried herself with as much resolve as she could muster. She never complained of the cold or the hardships, though she was not used to such a march. He tried to see to her comfort, ensuring she had extra blankets, that her tent was set in a less exposed area. They began developing small gestures of closeness, a soft touch on the arm, a sharing of a warm cup of mulled wine by the fire. It was not yet love, but a careful companionship, born of adversity and mutual respect. After weeks of trudging through snows and winding roads, they neared the Dreadfort. Dark banners bearing the flayed man flew over its battlements, a grim sight even among the horrors of war. The Bolton sigil had long been a source of dread, and Roose Bolton's reputation did little to ease minds. Nonetheless, Stannis was determined to either bring the Boltons into line or remove them if they stood against him. A parley was arranged at the gates. Stannis rode forth with Ser Davos, Melisandre, and a handful of loyal men. Jon accompanied them, though he felt an uneasy knot in his stomach. He had grown up hearing that the Boltons were powerful but cruel, and though they were nominally vassals of Winterfell, times had changed. Roose Bolton emerged, pale-faced and calm, his demeanor as unreadable as the snow. By his side stood his bastard son, Ramsay Snow, whose eyes gleamed with a disturbing light. The conversation was cold, both literally and figuratively. Stannis demanded the Boltons declare for him as the rightful king and unite in the campaign against the Lannisters. Roose pointedly questioned the validity of Stannis's claim, citing that the North recognized only the king in the North, Robb Stark. He eyed Jon with curiosity, addressing him as the bastard of Winterfell turned Baratheon lapdog, in a quiet, venomous voice. Jon bristled, but he remained silent, unwilling to trade insults. Roose was too cunning to outright refuse, but he did not yield either. He spoke of the ongoing chaos, suggesting that perhaps the Boltons would wait to see how events unfolded. If Stannis wished to remain in the Dreadfort's territory through winter, that might be negotiated for a price. His pale eyes flicked to Shireen at one point, a silent, unnerving assessment that made Jon grip the hilt of his sword. Melisandre's gaze burned in response, though she said nothing. The parley ended with no firm agreement, only a promise to hold further talks. Stannis returned to his camp in a seething mood, vowing that the Boltons would bend or break. The next day, scouts reported that Bolton troops were encamped in the hills, watchful. A battle seemed inevitable if neither side backed down. Stuck between wanting to preserve the unity of the North and upholding his vow to support Stannis, Jon wrestled with how to proceed. Fighting the Boltons could plunge the North into further chaos, making it impossible to coordinate with Robb. Yet if Bolton refused to acknowledge Stannis, that left the war in a stalemate. Morale in the camp dipped each day they lingered in the icy cold. Supplies ran low. Stannis raged that he would rather fight a short, decisive battle now than die slowly from starvation and frostbite. Ser Davos cautioned that an assault on the Dreadfort could be brutal. Melisandre claimed the flames would guide them, that victory was within reach if they believed in her god. Amid these swirling tensions, Shireen took it upon herself to approach her father privately. She knocked at his tent, where Stannis and Melisandre pored over maps. Stannis allowed her entry, though with a stern expression. She pleaded with him to avoid rash action. She spoke of the greater threat from the Lannisters, from the White Walkers, from the fracturing realm. Could they not find a way to bring House Bolton to their side without bloodshed? Stannis was not a man who softened easily, but he did care for his daughter in his own reserved way. He considered her words, though he did not promise peace. Melisandre watched Shireen with eyes that glowed like embers, silent judgment in her gaze. That night, a horrifying event shook the camp. Scouts discovered several men flayed and left hanging from trees outside the perimeter, the flayed man's sigil carved into their chests. A deliberate provocation, a show of brutality typical of House Bolton. The soldiers were outraged, calling for vengeance. Stannis's anger blazed. Roose Bolton had drawn first blood, albeit in a grotesque and cunning manner. The next morning, Stannis assembled his host, gave a short, cold speech about justice and retribution, and ordered the march on the Dreadfort. There would be no more attempts at negotiation. Jon felt dread coil in his stomach. He had seen little real battle, and the idea of storming a fortress in winter conditions was daunting. Still, he donned his cloak and armor, readied his sword, and prepared to stand with the northern men who had joined Stannis. Shireen stayed behind with a protective guard, her face pale as fresh snow. She tried to offer Jon some words of encouragement, but tears shone in her eyes. He hugged her gently before mounting his horse, promising to return. Ghost trotted beside him, ears pricked, sensing the tension. The assault on the Dreadfort was a savage affair. Stannis's men had to cross frozen ground under arrow fire, battered by icy winds and defenders who knew every inch of the fortress. The gates were strong, the walls thick. Siege engines strained as they hurled flaming projectiles at the battlements. Jon found himself in the thick of the melee, forging ahead with a group of northerners who recognized him as a Stark. Crossbow bolts whistled past. He glimpsed men screaming as they fell into the snow, blood painting it a vivid crimson. The cold bit at every exposed patch of skin, numbing hands and feet, turning swords into leaden weights. But the army pressed on, sustained by fury at the atrocities the Boltons had committed. Atop the walls, Ramsay Snow cackled, hurling taunts. He loosed hunting dogs at the attackers, savage brutes that tore into unarmored limbs. Jon slew 2 of them, Ghost ripping at a third. A swirl of chaotic images imprinted themselves on Jon's mind. The glow of flames, the hiss of arrows, the roar of men locked in mortal combat. At one point, he nearly lost his footing on the icy ground, stumbling back as a Bolton soldier aimed a spear at his chest. Ghost lunged, saving Jon from a fatal blow, and Jon repaid the loyal direwolf by dispatching the soldier with a swift thrust of Longclaw. Adrenaline coursed through him, erasing all sense of time. Throughout the carnage, Stannis pushed forward grimly, determined to claim victory. Melisandre stood a safe distance behind the lines, chanting in a foreign tongue, her red jewels glowing. Some soldiers swore later that they felt waves of warmth in the bitter cold, or saw flickers of shadow moving unnaturally among the ramparts. Whether it was the effect of the Red Woman's magic or the illusions of war-born terror, none could say for certain. Eventually, the gates began to splinter. Bolton men retreated deeper into the fortress. Stannis' forces, despite suffering heavy casualties, gained the upper hand through sheer determination and numbers. The walls were scaled, the portcullis was breached, and the courtyard turned into a grisly field of bodies. Roose Bolton was nowhere to be seen, though some claimed to have spotted him slipping away in the chaos. Ramsay fought with manic fury, but once the tide turned, he too disappeared, leaving his men to be slaughtered or taken prisoner. By the time the sun sank behind a veil of gray clouds, the stag and direwolf banners flew over the Dreadfort. Jon's arm felt leaden as he removed his helm, surveying the carnage. The Dreadfort had fallen, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of men lay dead or dying in the snow-covered courtyards and parapets. Boltons, Baratheons, Northerners, it scarcely mattered. Stannis strode through the ruined gates, lips thinned, unsmiling even in victory. Melisandre followed, the wind whipping her red robes around her lithe frame. She looked strangely triumphant, as if this bloodshed was a foregone conclusion in her prophecies. Jon felt hollow, unsure what to feel. The Boltons, sworn to Winterfell, had been adversaries, but they were Northerners all the same. This was a bloody beginning to an alliance meant to bring the North and House Baratheon together. Shireen arrived later, escorted by a contingent of guards. Her face was stricken at the sight of the dead. She rushed to Jon, relief washing over her when she saw he was alive, though battered and splattered with blood. He assured her he was unhurt except for cuts and bruises. Stannis offered a curt nod to his daughter, but his focus was on commanding the cleanup, disposing of Bolton corpses, and securing the fortress. The men found horrific sights in the dungeons, further proof of Bolton depravity. Stannis ordered any survivors who resisted to be executed, though some might be spared if they bent the knee. In the aftermath, the dark fortress of the Boltons became a temporary camp for the victors. The wounded were tended as best they could be, though resources were scarce. Shireen, seeing the suffering, insisted on helping. She visited makeshift infirmaries, offering blankets, water, and what small comforts she could. Some men were initially startled to see the scarred Baratheon princess among them, but her gentle manner soothed them. Jon assisted as well, remembering how his father always believed in caring for even the lowliest of men. Yet the mood was grim. Roose and Ramsay had escaped, presumably to regroup or flee. They remained a threat. Stannis grew more impatient, pressing to push onward, to call other northern houses to heel. Thus the North's winter campaign continued. Houses that despised the Boltons saw Stannis as a potential savior. Others who had sworn to Robb Stark were uncertain about bending the knee to Stannis, even with Jon and Shireen as living symbols of unity. The war scattered families and fractured allegiances. Rumors circulated about the state of the Riverlands, about Joffrey's cruelty in King's Landing, about Renly's growing host in the Reach. None could say when or how the war would end. All the while, the snows grew heavier, the nights colder. More ravens arrived from the wall, pleading for aid against the wildlings and the unnatural threat stirring in the far north. Jon felt the weight of it bearing down on him. He had wanted to protect his home and avenge his father. Now he found himself in a churning maelstrom of alliances, battles, and uncertain loyalties. The union with Shireen had bound him to a king with an iron will and a red shadow at his side. At night, in the rudimentary chambers of the Dreadfort, he and Shireen clung to each other more for comfort than passion, exchanging soft whispers about the life they had somehow fallen into. She voiced her fears about the Red Woman, about her father's unwavering stance. Jon shared his grief for Ned, his dread for the realm's future if the White Walkers were truly returning. They found a measure of solace in each other's presence, though they could not banish the nightmares that haunted their sleep. Yet as the bleak days passed, a strange resilience began to form between them. They were young, and the world was dark, but they resolved to do what they could. Shireen reminded Jon that he carried his father's spirit, that he could lead with honor and compassion. Jon reminded her that she had a strength of her own, born of surviving grayscale and a lonely childhood. Together, they might not shape the entire war, but they could try to guide it toward something better than endless bloodshed. It was a fragile hope, as thin as a single thread in a tapestry of violence. But it was hope, nonetheless. Stannis decided to march south once more, hoping to link with Robb Stark's forces before the snows made all travel impossible. To do so, he needed a route that avoided the worst of the winter storms. Scouts fanned out, seeking passes that might remain open. The king's retinue grew as some smaller northern houses, fearful of the Boltons and resentful of the Lannisters, joined his cause. Others closed their gates or vanished into the wilderness, determined to stay out of the war. Meanwhile, the ravens from the wall became ever more desperate. Jon urged Stannis to send men to the wall, but Stannis refused, saying he could not weaken his already strained forces. Perhaps, he reasoned, once they won a decisive victory against the Lannisters, they would turn their attention to the true north. The days merged into a harsh odyssey. Snowfall slowed their pace to a crawl, rations dwindled, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Men muttered that this was madness. Ser Davos tried to keep morale afloat, but despair settled in. Melisandre still seemed impervious, a red beacon in the white wilderness, speaking of how the Lord of Light tested them. Shireen rode with Jon, often wrapped in furs, silent except for soft murmurs of concern. Ghost padded through the snow, the only one who seemed to navigate the drifts with ease. Occasionally, riders brought word of Robb's progress, but no direct instructions. The king in the north was embroiled in battles near the Twins and Harrenhal, forging uneasy alliances with the Freys. Communication was sporadic at best. At last, they reached the outskirts of a forest that promised some shelter from the worst of the storm. Stannis commanded camp be made. Tents rose among the trees, fires crackled. Men trudged to gather what would they could. Jon and Shireen's tent was set up near the center, guarded by a ring of Baratheon soldiers. That night, the wind howled, shaking the branches overhead. Jon sat inside, stoking the small brazier that provided meager warmth. Shireen huddled in blankets. They spoke in low voices about what the future might hold. Their conversation was interrupted when Melisandre arrived unannounced. She ducked into the tent, ignoring the guards' protests. Her red eyes flicked over them, lingering on Shireen. Jon felt an instinctive protectiveness surge in his chest. Melisandre said the flames had granted her a vision of an oncoming darkness greater than any Lannister. She insisted that Stannis was the prince that was promised, the one fated to stand against this darkness. She looked upon Jon with an odd curiosity, as though trying to read secrets in the lines of his face. Shireen trembled under her gaze. Then, without elaborating further, Melisandre departed, leaving a cold sense of foreboding in her wake. Outside, the wind shrieked. That night, Jon found sleep impossible, haunted by thoughts of the White Walkers, of Ned Stark's death, of a realm crumbling under the weight of war. He lay beside Shireen, listening to her soft breaths, hoping that they might someday see a world beyond endless snow and bloodshed. Dawn brought no respite. The storm had intensified, lashing the forest with snow so dense one could scarcely see a few feet ahead. Stannis ordered the men to hunker down, to wait it out rather than risk losing half his force to the wilderness. Thus began a grim vigil. Food dwindled, tempers flared, arguments broke out among the soldiers. Some blamed Melisandre's presence for bringing ill fortune. Others cursed the north for its harshness, or cursed Stannis for leading them here. Shireen overheard some of this talk and felt a pang of guilt, wondering if her marriage had dragged these men into an unwinnable war. Jon comforted her, reminding her that these were the decisions of kings and lords, not a young girl who only did her duty. When the storm finally eased, scouts ventured out to find the route ahead buried under drifts taller than a man. They returned, shaking their heads. The pass was impassable, at least until the snow thawed or they found another way around. But to turn back now meant giving up weeks of progress, returning to the coast or the Dreadfort. The war would not wait. Stannis would not wait. He pressed them onward through alternate paths, narrower trails that twisted through the forest. The The column was forced to split in places, losing cohesion. Accidents happened. Men broke through ice-covered streams and drowned. Carts toppled. Valuable supplies spilled into the snow. Whispered curses followed every mishap. And then the Bolton remnants struck, led by Ramsay's savage cunning. They ambushed pockets of the Baratheon column, striking by night, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Men went missing, only to be found later flayed or devoured by dogs. Fear spread like a plague, infecting even veteran soldiers. Stannis raged, vowing to exterminate every last Bolton if it took him 1,000 years. Jon fought in skirmishes, feeling the sting of near frostbitten cheeks and the terror that came with every arrow whistling past. He worried constantly for Shireen, who traveled with the main body of the host, guarded but still vulnerable. Little by little, the battered host pressed on, forging a winding path south, always south, seeking some respite from the relentless cold. Among the trees, they found abandoned villages, looted and burned. Tracks suggested that Bolton outriders still prowled the area. Each night, the watch was doubled. Melisandre's presence remained eerie, her prayers echoing in the hush of the snowy woods. If she performed any overt sorcery, none could say, but some men muttered that the shadows moved unnaturally in her vicinity. Shireen did not speak with her father as often, for Stannis was consumed by the burden of command. She clung to Jon's steady presence, and in the gloom of their shared tent, they formed a bond that transcended political arrangement. They were two young souls caught in a brutal web of destiny, relying on each other for solace. Finally, after many days of slow, tortured travel, they emerged from the densest part of the forest. Before them stretched a flat expanse covered in snow, but in the far distance, they glimpsed rolling hills that might lead to roads more frequently traveled. Beyond those hills lay the southern edges of the north, closer to the neck. If they could reach Moat Cailin, perhaps they could meet with Robb's envoys, or at least find a corridor to the Riverlands. Stannis wasted no time, ordering the camp to continue forward. The storm clouds had broken, revealing a gray sky that felt almost welcoming compared to the blizzards they had endured. They made camp that evening on the edge of the flatlands, the men more hopeful now that the worst of the forest was behind them. Jon and Shireen huddled near a fire, speaking quietly. Ghost rested at Jon's side, ears alert. The conversation turned to the future. If they could join Robb, perhaps they might force the Lannisters to negotiate. Or if they marched on King's Landing from the north while Renly pressed from the south, Cersei might be cornered. It was a glimmer of possibility, enough to stir Shireen's spirits. She allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. But as night fell, the howling of Bolton dogs reached them on the wind. A chill ran through the camp. Men scrambled to weapons. Stannis ordered them to form lines, preparing for another ambush. Indeed, the Boltons struck again, but this time it was not a guerrilla raid. Ramsay had gathered a larger force, likely augmented by outlaws and other northern defectors. Their howling dogs surged across the snow, men screaming savage war cries. The Baratheon host responded, charging forward to meet them. Flaming arrows arced through the darkness, setting tents ablaze. Chaos erupted once more, the madness of war overshadowing any fragile illusions of safety. Jon and Shireen were separated in the initial surge, as Ghost darted to intercept a dog that lunged at them. Guards closed in around Shireen, pulling her back from the fray. Jon drew Longclaw, stepping into the swirling melee. Screams split the air, metal clashed on metal, and the stench of burning canvas choked his senses. He caught sight of Ramsay's twisted grin through the flickering flames, the bastard of Bolton relishing the slaughter. Jon pressed forward, determined to protect Shireen, determined to end the Bolton threat once and for all. Around them, men died in the snow, footprints stained red. Stannis' voice bellowed commands, rallying the soldiers. Melisandre's chants cut through the din, though whether her magic aided or simply unnerved them was unclear. Jon clashed with a Bolton man-at-arms, trading furious blows. His sword felt impossibly heavy, but the memory of Ned Stark's death, the cruelty inflicted upon his father, drove him on. The man-at-arms fell and Jon advanced, Flames leapt from a burning cart, illuminating the battlefield in a hellish glow. He glimpsed Shireen across the way, being hurried toward the rear by her guards. A shadowy figure loomed behind them. Time seemed to slow. Ramsay Snow moved with a predator's grace, his dogs at his heels. He was inside the perimeter of guards, the men falling to quick, savage strikes. Shireen stumbled in the snow, her face a mask of terror as she turned to see her attackers. Jon shouted her name, straining to reach her, but bodies pressed around him. A frenzy of swords clashed, and he could not break free fast enough. He saw Ramsay's blade glint in the firelight. Shireen tried to scramble away, but Ramsay was upon her in seconds, the dogs snarling. Jon felt the world spin. He hacked his way through the throng with furious desperation, Ghost bounding ahead of him. Shireen's guards were either dead or locked in combat. She cowered near a half-collapsed tent, eyes wide. Ramsay's grin was the stuff of nightmares, lips parted in cruel delight. He raised his dagger. Ghost lunged at him, but one of Ramsay's dogs barreled into the direwolf, snapping and clawing. Jon's voice tore from his throat in a raw roar. He drove forward, slamming his sword toward Ramsay. At the last moment, Ramsay whirled, parrying Jon's blow. Their blades locked. Ramsay's eyes gleamed. "The new pup of Winterfell," he sneered, shoving Jon back. Jon recovered, slashing at Ramsay's side. It was a fierce duel, each fueled by hatred and fear. Ramsay was quicker than Jon expected, dancing away from mortal strikes, returning savage cuts that Jon barely deflected. Shireen lay trembling in the snow, uncertain if she dared move. The dogs circled, one wounded by Ghost, another sniffing at Shireen's cloak. Jon pressed on, fists clenched around Longclaw. His arms ached, lungs burned from the cold air, but he refused to give an inch. An unexpected thrust slipped past Ramsay's guard, biting into his flank. Ramsay hissed in pain, face contorting. Before Jon could finish him, a dog latched onto Jon's leg, teeth sinking through leather. He yelled in agony, staggering. Ramsay seized the opening, swinging his dagger for a killing blow. But Shireen, with a surge of courage born of terror and desperation, grabbed a broken spear from the ground. She lurched to her feet, plunging the jagged tip into Ramsay's side. He snarled, half turning to strike her, giving Jon the second he needed. Jon wrenched his leg free of the dog's jaws, ignoring the pain, and drove Longclaw straight into Ramsay's chest. The bastard of Bolton's eyes went wide. He sputtered, a crimson froth speckling his lips, before collapsing into the snow. His dogs scattered, howling. Jon panted, blood roaring in his ears. Ghost finished off the dog that had attacked him. He knelt by Shireen, who trembled, clutching the broken spear. She had a shallow cut on her arm, her cloak torn, but she was alive. Jon's leg bled heavily from the dog bite, but he pushed the pain aside. He scooped Shireen up, staggering back from Ramsay's corpse. Around them, the fighting still raged. Yet the sight of Ramsay falling seemed to break the Bolton force's spirit. Some men threw down their arms, others fled. The Baratheon host pressed the advantage, driving them into the darkness. By the time the sun rose, the Bolton ambush had been repelled. Bodies littered the snow, and the stench of charred tents hung thick. Jon and Shireen were taken to the healers. Jon's leg wound, though painful, was not fatal. Shireen's cut was but bled enough to require stitching. She was shaken, but she clung to Jon's hand with fierce relief. Stannis strode through the aftermath, ordering the survivors to form ranks, gathering the prisoners. Melisandre offered no comfort, only proclaiming that darkness had been driven back once more. As the day wore on, news spread that Ramsay Snow was dead. Some men cheered, others sighed in relief, but there was still no sign of Roose Bolton, who might yet regroup. For now, at least one of the most vicious threats to the north had been ended. Jon was hailed by some as a hero, though he felt no triumph. He had killed a monster, yes, but the cost was high. Countless bodies lay in the snow. In the quiet that followed, Shireen found Jon in their patched tent. Ghost lay near the entrance, licking his own wounds. Shireen knelt beside Jon, who winced at the throbbing pain in his bandaged leg. Gently, she placed a trembling hand on his cheek, tears lining her eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. The memory of Ramsay's blade loomed between them. At last, Jon pulled her into a careful embrace, mindful of his injuries. They stayed that way for a time, two battered youths in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. Outside, Stannis and his commanders planned their next move. Some advocated continuing south, linking with whatever remained of Robb's forces. Others argued they should remain in the north, consolidating now that the Boltons had been dealt a blow. Still others said they should answer the wall's cries for help, believing the supernatural threat might be more pressing. Stannis listened to all sides, expression grim. The war was far from over, but the alliance between the North and House Baratheon had taken root, watered by the blood spilled at the Dreadfort and the ambush. In the following weeks, the host slowly resumed its march, albeit at a slower pace due to the casualties and the battered condition of the survivors. Jon's leg improved gradually, thanks to the attentions of the healers and Shireen's help. She insisted on helping change his bandages, though it sickened her to see the wound. In the stolen moments they had, they spoke of how to mend the North after all this bloodshed, how to face the Lannisters, how to honor Ned Stark's memory. Shireen, though still shy and fearful at times, showed a quiet determination that matched Jon's own. Word eventually came that Robb Stark had called a great council of Northern lords, presumably to discuss a truce or alliance with any faction willing to see the Lannisters fall. If Stannis attended, perhaps they could forge a unified front. The details were sparse, for ravens often went astray in these tumultuous times, but it was a glimmer of hope that the king in the north and the would-be king on the Iron Throne might sit at the same table without swords drawn. And so the battered remains of Stannis's army, augmented by northern bannermen who had thrown in their lot, pressed onward, forging a path through winter's grip. In the nights to come, Jon and Shireen shared a tent, a bond, and a tentative dream. They were part of something larger than themselves. Stark and Baratheon, two lines of honor and duty. The realm bled, but if their marriage could help knit at least part of it back together, they would not shrink from the responsibility. It would be a long, uncertain road, fraught with betrayals, new alliances, and the looming specter of the White Walkers. Yet in each other they found a measure of courage. In a land of betrayal, perhaps their promise to one another might stand as a beacon of unity. Even as snow continued to fall across the north, drifting in thick banks around the trees, they moved onward. Horses plodded through the slush, soldiers huddled in cloaks. Stannis rode at the front, Melisandre's red robes a constant reminder of the fire he served, while behind them, Jon and Shireen followed, the banner of the direwolf mingling with the banner of the crowned stag. In distant King's Landing, the Lannisters might still plot and scheme, but here in the heart of the North, a different alliance was being forged, one that would, for better or worse, shape the fate of the realm. And so their story began in earnest, a tale of winter's fury, of a marriage born of necessity yet tempered by respect and budding affection, of houses that once were dear friends, now joined anew against a common foe. Whatever trials lay ahead, whether the South would yield to Stannis' rightful claim, whether Robb Stark's crown would endure, or whether the White Walkers would descend upon them all, they would face it together, guided by the memory of honor that Ned Stark had instilled in Jon and by the steadfast determination that Stannis Baratheon had passed to his only child. In a realm where dragons stirred across the sea and lions prowled in the capital, the wolf and the stag walked side by side, forging a fragile hope in a world gone mad with war.